screen?
I think you'll find you can do.
Okay, that's great. Okay, before we get on to that, first of all, it's such a joy being with everybody here and seeing all your lovely faces. It's wonderful. It's just, I just want to stay here looking at your faces all the time. As you, perhaps if you haven't met me before, you can tell by my accent, I'm Welsh. I was born and brought up in Cardiff, and I live in the valleys now. So I escaped the big city, and I'm living in the valleys in a lovely area, in actual fact. But I just want to say, Malcolm, that I want to speak on for a little bit on sort of personal transformation, not so much connecting it with the young people's empowerment program, which you had on the covering letter there. I hope you don't mind if I don't make references to that, but many of the things I'm going to speak out about in some way or another have been connected with the empowerment program, which we rolled out in many schools in Swindon some years ago. So on this theme of equality and creating a just society, I want to start by speaking about an analogy. And I love analogies because they quickly get us into something that we can get a handle on. So I see the whole world at this moment like a large rowing boat. And if you can imagine, we're on this, everybody in the planet is on this rowing boat. And we've got to decide what direction we're going to go, where we would like to go, how we get there, how we can all pull together, how we can not take our oars and bash each other over the head, or give us gentle digs in the ribs with our oars, or in actual fact, just chuck our oars overboard. There's a massive problems that we have in enabling humanity to pull together in a direction which is outlined in the Baha'i faith, which is the coming together, the whole of mankind as one on this planet. We see each other as one human race, and how do we come together and act as if we're one family? And justice is at the heart of it. So that's the simplest thing I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the talk. I want to go into some quotations now. So I'm going on to some screen sharing. I call this screen sharing if it doesn't work out properly. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, I need a reader now. So I'm just wondering, Penny, are you okay to read that with, it might be difficult with the difficult eyes?
Probably be better if I did it, Derek.
Okay, Malcolm, please do. Hang on, Penny's off and she's on mute.
Yeah, I can do it. It's okay.
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 Prevailing, do you want me to read it?
Yeah,
Yes,
go ahead.
please.
Okay, prevailing condition of humanity. Humanity is gripped by a crisis of identity as various peoples and groups struggle to define themselves, their place in the world, and how they should act. Without a vision of shared identity and common purpose, they fall into competing ideologies and power struggles. Seemingly countless permutations of us and them define group identities, ever more narrowly and in contrast to one another. Over time, this splintering into divergent interest groups has weakened the cohesion of society itself. Rival conceptions about the primacy of a particular people are peddled to the exclusion of the truth that humanity is on a common journey in which all are protagonists. Consider how radically different such a fragmented conception of human identity is from the one that follows from a recognition of the oneness of humanity. In this perspective, the diversity that characterizes the human family, far from contradicting its oneness, endows it with richness.
Thanks very much, Penny. So I put in bold there what stands out to me from this with regards to all pulling together on this boat. Humanity is on a common journey in which we're all protagonists, we're all actors, we're all players in this wonderful achievement to bring us all together. And the other one is founded on the recognition of the oneness of mankind, but we're struggling with each other because we don't know how to relate to each other. And what I want to focus on now is not so much a secular way of looking at equality and just society, but I want to go to the heart of it, as I understand, from a faith point of view. So I'm looking at now this concept that Baha'u'llah gives us with regards to all the great messengers of God, or avatars, or we call them manifestations of God, or prophets, a variety of names for these powerful individuals sent with a mission to bring us closer to God and closer to each other. So this is Baha'u'llah writes, the prophets of God should be regarded as physicians whose task is to foster the well-being of the world and its peoples, that through the spirit of oneness they may heal the sickness of a divided humanity. And that's throughout history. We've had these great teachers that have come from God. We hardly know the names of any of them because they've been lost in history. But you know, hopefully we can get to know more of them as science, historical science goes into that field. So I want to look now at some of the passages from the holy writings of some of the major faiths that we know of, just to center ourselves that this is a faith. We're looking at things from a faith point of view and how we can bring these wonderful teachings that are in all the faiths, which are in total agreement with regards to the virtues or common values that we should share. And that's why I'm in an interfaith group in Cardiff, and you folks up there are as well, and in other places. So, but before we go to that, just have a look at this. Penny, if you can read out that one. Now, humanity is to create a creative purpose for humanity. Yeah, a common purpose.
Humanity is created
I've done that wrong. Don't worry about that.
Ignore that bit.
It's Welsh. It's Welsh way of doing things.
All men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. The Almighty beareth me witness. To act like the beasts of the field is unworthy of man. Those virtues that befit his dignity are forbearance, mercy, compassion, and loving kindness towards all the peoples and kindreds of the earth.
So it's nice to know that we've been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization, and we're pushed to that now. We have to discover or learn how to do it. Otherwise, we start going backwards, and there's a possibility the human race could perish if we go backwards anymore. So I'm focused now on core values of focus on justice. So in Hinduism, I'll read out these ones now. Justice being violated destroys. Justice being preserved preserves. Therefore, justice must not be violated, lest violated justice destroys us. What a profound statement from Hinduism. In Judaism, to do justice and judgment is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. In Buddhism, whoever has understood the law of justice as taught by the well-awakened one, and I think the well-awakened one are like the Buddhas, the prophets, or the great teachers from God, should revere the teacher as the priest worships the sacrificial fire. From Christianity, His Holiness Christ, I can of mine own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father which has sent me. A focus on where do we learn about justice? And it's coming from these great prophets or messengers of God, no matter what we call them. As I emphasized before, as Baha'is, we call them manifestations of God because they manifest these wonderful qualities that we're looking into. From the Sikh faith, he judges each and every being. By the hukam, or God's order of his command, he leads us on. Justice is in your hands, O Lord. You are pleasing to my mind. And from Islam, O ye who believe, be ye steadfast in justice, witnessing before God, though it be against yourselves or your parents or your kindred, be it rich or poor, for God is nearer akin than either. And from Baha'i faith, these are in chronological order, by the way, in which they come throughout history. And I put Baha'i faith last because it's the most up-to-date revelation, we would say, from God through the founder Baha'u'llah. O Son of Spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight, as God's sight, is justice. Turn not away therefrom, if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes. So if we want a society that's pulling together, we have to have justice at the center of it in all our relationships, as well as love and compassion and mercy and wisdom. But that has to be the heart of all the international relationships to start with. So this is focused on the transformation of the individual. And these quotations here, they apply, most of them apply to the individual. How do we take the words of these great teachers? How do we apply them in our own lives to be just in this particular instance? And another thing that the great teachers tell us about is that we have a soul or a spirit, call it what you like, but it's the non-physical part of ourselves, which in actual fact is the reality of ourselves. So Penny, if you'd like to read out, these two are from the Baha'i writings.
Okay. Thou hast asked me concerning the nature of the soul. Know verily that the soul is a sign of God, a heavenly gem whose reality the most learned of men hath failed to grasp, and whose mystery no mind, however acute, can ever hope to unravel. Man is,
sorry, go on, Penny. Yeah.
okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Man is in reality a spiritual being, and only when he lives in the spirit is he truly happy.
Thanks, Penny. So when we talk about identity as Baha'is, we can say mankind is one, that's our identity, we're all human beings, but at the heart of that is our soul. And I think we have to learn to see each other, not so much as bodies with our separate sort of physical constructs and so on, but to see each other as souls that are linked with a body. And that's why it says man in reality is a spiritual being. And only when we can start seeing things with a spiritual understanding and spiritual insight, then we will live in that spirit and then we will be truly happy. But we get these understandings from these great manifestations of God. Okay, so Penny, if you'd like to read out that one as well.
Okay. Know thou of a truth that the soul, after its separation from the body, will continue to progress until it attaineth the presence of God, in a state and condition which neither the revolution of ages and centuries, nor the changes and chances of this world can alter. It will endure as long as the kingdom of God, his sovereignty, his dominion and power will endure. It will manifest the signs of God and his attributes, and will reveal his loving kindness and bounty.
Thanks, Penny. That's wonderful. So all the faiths in actual fact identify something that exists past the body, no matter what name it's called. We call it the soul. It can be called by different things. It doesn't matter. There's a reality that exists, which is non-physical, which is our reality, which exists after we physically die. And that has implications for how we behave here, because part of the teachings of all the great messengers of God is to enable us to prepare ourselves for the life to come. Not to put all our emphasis on it, not to say, well, I'm doing this because I am preparing, but as a byproduct of carrying forward an ever advancing civilization, we can prepare for the life beyond. So that's why it says at the bottom, in this world, he must prepare himself for the life beyond. That's where we come into another stage of existence there. We can have a taste of that or an insight into that when we go to sleep at night and we go into that dream world. And that's be a lovely subject to go into another time. I'm just jumping now. This one at the end of physical, and perhaps this is the most difficult thing to come to grips with in a secular materialistic society. At the end of physical life, what's going to happen? And all the faiths give some answer to this. They speak about it in different ways, but the reality is that there is a summation of our life when we go into the next world. In the Baha'i writings, it says, O son of being, bring thyself to account each day ere thou art summoned to a reckoning. For death and heraldage shall come upon thee, and thou shalt be called to give account for thy deeds. And I think, dear friends, in the absence of these understandings, the mind, we put the mind as our deity that we worship, our rational faculties, rather than God or a higher power, realizing that we've been created with a purpose to come closer to God, to come closer to each other, to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. And to the degree that we've done that, in this day will be the degree of this being summoned to account as far as I can make out. And it doesn't mean to say that everybody has to be a Baha'i to do this, but what part can people play in bringing about a just and equitable society where we love each other and we're willing to overlook each other's shortcomings, but we're willing to work together and row together on this boat. So there, at the end of life, there is a summation, which Baha'u'llah is saying that we will be called to give an account for our deeds. And this is not accepted in a materialistic society. I think it scares people to death in actual fact. But if it's a reality, it's something I think we have to put at the center of how we go about life, because our life is here for a purpose, and we can misuse that purpose, or we can use it to the advantage of the rest of mankind, and a rewarding life for ourselves, because there's happiness being involved in living the life of the spirit. And I think that's all I want to say at this moment. But just to emphasize that this process of transforming from just a materialistic way of looking at things to spiritual ways of looking at things, that's why we turn to the great messengers of God. And that's why I believe more and more people are becoming aware of the input from all the faiths that we've had throughout history, from these divine messengers, and the significance of them. And we are beginning to appreciate that although they say it in different ways, they speak with the same spirit. It's the same spirit, it's the same teaching given in different ways and parables and analogies and so on. And when we realize that, we can start working together as religions, because friends, there's no way this boat is going to get to any safe place unless people realize that the religions here have all come from the same source, from a higher power, and it's here to help us row together. So I think I better stop there, and thank you very much.
Okay, if you could stop the share then, Pip. But thank you, Viv. Yeah, that was wonderful, Viv, and I'm sure that's got our grey cells ticking over. I hope people are writing down their questions, because I would like not to stop for questions now, but to carry on to Derek next, if he would unmute himself, and we would love to hear from Derek, and then we'll start with questions and discussions after Derek's spoken. So Derek, if you could unmute your screen, please. You've succeeded.
I think so. This is not my computer, it's my daughter's. So you have to get used to it. Thank you for all that. You reminded me of thing from the Zoroastrian religion, which is the end line. When you're on the bridge, if you've lived a good life and you're a man, you meet the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. So if you're a woman, you meet the most handsome man you've seen. And if you haven't lived a good life, you meet the ugliest woman you've ever seen, or the ugliest man you've ever seen, which is a reflection of what you're like, which is a good lesson for all of us. One of the things that's occurred, certainly in my lifetime, is how our knowledge of our past has become of great interest to people. I could never imagine as a small child being terribly into dinosaurs. And as we all know, if we have children or grandchildren, they say the names amazingly correctly, which and you see films produced which, picture how the world was like, and you have people speculating that they can actually create dinosaurs from DNA that's gathered. This things may be possible. The size of dinosaurs, I don't think I particularly want to share an Earth with these enormous creatures, and that was how it was, millions of years ago. So human beings, it seems, came into being, and you might remember there was the big fuss about this lady called Lucy. And I think it was like 1 million years ago when she emerged in Africa. And all I could see was that everybody was immediately dumping on this poor soul who I can safely say was not called Lucy. She was called Glenys or something like that. But certainly she wasn't called Lucy. And so that it seemed that all the commentators were dumping all the ills of humanity of this poor soul whose remains happened to be fossilized, we could dig them out. And I think that showed a lack of understanding of what our ancestors were like. I remember being told as a youth or a child that Neanderthal man was some sort of hulking ape, was basically break through doors and would probably eat you if they were alive. And what we've discovered was they honored the dead, and when they buried them with reverence. And a real key thing was that they discovered people whose bones had healed from a break. And if you are in a society which cares for you so that your bone can be healed, like your leg or your arm or whatever, that shows it's a society that was supporting each other. So far from our ancestors being these sort of wild dinosaur-like or savage creatures, they obviously cared for each other, and they had customs and practices which meant they had reverence for each other. And that sort of development of human society is perhaps how we search for a way in which we could run ourselves. Now, it's a fairly well-established, and it's probably correct, that we were hunter-gatherers. We moved around and we hunted and we gathered herbs and fruits and whatever, and that's on what we lived on. And clearly in those societies, there was some sort of hierarchy developed. How it was, the manner in which it ran, there's plenty of speculation, but we don't really know. Except it's fairly obvious they had an ability to come together to produce things which can all be regarded as great works. Stonehenge, which has wrongly been attributed to the Druids, was built by people who are fundamentally hunter-gatherers. But they came together and they built these stone circles, which clearly had tremendous importance to them around the world. Specifically for ourselves in Europe, they built them and they developed. So they had some way of communicating and working together. We've now discovered that they didn't drag all the stones all the way from Wales. They found out where the quarry was, and it was relatively close to Stonehenge for the larger stones. But even if it was only fairly close to Stonehenge, it required a great deal of collaboration. So one of the challenges is if we are going to develop societies in which the capacity of human beings is recognized and develops, then we're really going to have to rethink how it is, because we still live in a world. So I'm having a funny thing coming up, which is blocking the view. Excuse me. We still live in a world in which people live at different levels of society. With some people, we still have a few hunter-gatherers left, not many, but we still have them. But not everybody has the internet. Not everybody has the telephone. I remember going to discussion with somebody when they were talking about putting telephone service into Africa, and they were talking about the enormous cost it was going to be for that. Of course, they were talking about landlines, the hard wiring. And then, of course, the internet came and Wi-Fi, and immediately it became much easier to collaborate. But we have not recognized the capacity which is there within human beings. In the UK, I always remember being horrified to read that in the 1930s, when it came up to Parliament to extend further education to 15, there was a large minority of the members of Parliament who voted against that. And the reason was that the working class was too stupid to take advantage of higher education, would therefore be a waste of public funds to do that. That prejudice towards various groups of society is universal. So the capacity of human beings has not to develop everybody, but just to develop a certain section. The biggest or the largest discrimination has been against women. The fact is, women were precluded from education. At Cambridge, they established a college outside the city boundaries and put Girton, and therefore Girton College was where women went, and they were allowed to attend lectures, but not really attended. And that's universal throughout the UK. Nothing unusual in that respect. As though women somehow or another were not capable of demonstrating higher brain power. So that's slightly more than 50% of the human population. So all the advancement that we may have done, and we've been around for 1 million years, though now they, by the way, some remains which indicates we were probably around 4 million years. They haven't given the person a name yet, but I'm sure they will. But that's not what we're talking about. So the fact that that aspect of human society was not allowed to be educated, did that mean that women didn't want to be educated? No, there's plenty of true stories where women did everything they could to become educated. They wanted to learn how to read and write. They wanted to learn all the various things, but they were being precluded by society. So one of the things to carry forward is that we have to find a way to eliminate these ingrained prejudices which we've acquired, so that human society can reflect what humanity actually is. The second thing is the problem over race. Now, I'm in the past life, if you like, when I was younger, I was blonde, I had blonde hair, and then I got sort of gray highlights, and that blue eye, everything else. That was what a gentleman who ran part of Europe thought was the ideal person. Somebody was tall, had blue eyes and everything else. And that's where we talk about white supremacy. And we divided up the human race, as I was told and brought up, into 5 different races. The greatest was the white ones, the one that looked like me. And everybody else was inferior. The fun thing is, if you ask somebody who was Chinese, they could tell you about their great civilizations and the things they did, and that made no difference at all to the English. I mean, the Boxer Rebellion is referred to, and the problems in China was because the British in particular wanted to sell opium there. And the Chinese emperor said no, because it was destroying his society. So the exploitation of people for financial purposes became more and more hideous. People who were African were shipped across the Atlantic, into America and Canada and parts of the West Indies as slaves to be owned. And having lived as long as we have in the US, you can't imagine, unless you live there, how they had created problems to demean somebody who was black. a wonderful friend of ours who's sadly has passed on now, and his wife's a Baha'i. He came to me and he said, Derek, what's the proper name for these? And I said, what? What are you talking about? And he was pointing at Brazil nuts. I said, they're called Brazil nuts. He said, thank you. At least now I can talk about Brazil nuts that I like. And I said, why? And he said, well, he said, unfortunately, I come from Texas, and in Texas, they're referred to with the N-word, toes. I said, you're joking. He said, no. He said, you have to understand everything is put in racial terms. And you have to, if you have to be there to understand that. Now, when you take, what's interesting about the Americas, they had a shortage of labor. So in order to get the plantations in the south of the United States running, they had to bring in African slaves. Now, and this is, I'm not being derogatory against the Roman Catholic Church when I say this, so as it's interfaith week, but the Pope at that time in the 15th century, 16th century, he gave South America, apart from Brazil, to the Spanish, and he gave Brazil to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese were given then sort of the rest of the world, like Japan and places like that. So he decided, you know, in his beneficence, to do that. The Spanish then had a problem to get slaves into South America, because under Spanish law, a person could not be a slave. So if people were imported from a Spanish colony, they couldn't be sold. So what happened was they franchised the operation and handed it out. So they too imported slaves into what's termed Latin America. What's interesting is that when Latin America was going towards freedom through Bolivia, who was this incredible young man who came from a very wealthy family in Venezuela, he came to Europe as, you know, like a trip around Europe and for his education. And he got caught up in the Napoleonic fever of liberty and everything, which is what occurred with the French Revolution. And he took those ideas back to Latin America. What's interesting is that whereas in North America, especially the United States, they had the problem with slaves, and eventually they had the war of the Civil War there. In Latin America, Bolivia said that it was too diverse a continent to have the same sort of federated system as they had in America. But one of the things that they did in Latin America, all the countries that emerged there from Bolivia, he fought over 100 battles to free Bolivia from Spanish rule. They all passed a law which abolished slavery. So they were in advance of what is in America. The problem in America, and it applies elsewhere, is that those prejudices remain. So if you're going to move forward and have a society where justice and equality will exist based upon the sort of people that Viv was mentioning, there has to become a radical change of behavior. I remember when I first became a Baha'i, I noticed that Baha'u'llah just referred to one race, the human race. So I actually said, and you know, I was like 22, I said, well, we don't believe in races. And immediately I had hot coals poured on me. And don't be silly, you know, we have the red race, the yellow race. And I said, no, Baha'u'llah says the human race. And I was then told, you're talking nonsense, Derek. You know, we know there's different races. And I said, well, it seems to me, Baha'u'llah, it's not saying that, and I don't believe it. And I said, actually, when I look into other religions, they're saying the same thing. I don't see where this justification comes from. And of course, it's now been proved there's only one race. Now, I haven't gone around and called all people who poured hot coals on my head because I was saying that, because most of them have passed on now and they should know better. But the fact is that fundamental concept that we have different races and therefore we should respect them all, which means we don't, it's one of the major problems that exists. Now, one of the things that occurred when people started examining Greece was everyone said, wow, the Greeks believe in free democracy. And this really, certainly in the 18th and 19th century, was really copied into Europe and then went across into the Americas. And the real question is, what is democracy? Now, the Greeks, bless them, never practiced democracy. That's a myth. And they didn't practice democracy because in all cases, for their various societies, whether it was Sparta, that was really more of a military dictatorship, or Athens, they needed slaves to run their society. So they didn't have a freedom of voting. But democracy is one of the things which has taken hold in the minds and hearts of people. It's something that people want to believe in. The reason that there was changes of government in this country was because people wanted the rights for people to occur. So societies in the future are going to have to find a way to acknowledge that desire of participation there is for people to belong and to be involved in. It may mean several radical changes. And that's why most of you, I think, in this audience of Baha'is, there's a great talk about the lesser peace, which is what we believe is where the countries of the world will come together and they will set up an agreement, a time of peace for the first time in human history. And that will give a foundation, a platform on which the most great peace, which is the coming together of the peoples of the world in the kingdom of God. Excuse me. One of the things that I've noticed about democracy is this idea that we have to have full participation. So one thought for the future may be to acquire a more just society is these very large countries that we now have are too large to work to give a full participation of all the peoples in the world. Now that doesn't mean that we are disloyal to any countries. I'm not saying that for 1 minute, but it may be when we look out the geopolitical map of the world is drawn up. If you look back 2,000 years, countries that were there then, in some cases, don't exist now. And there's new countries have emerged. So the reason for drawing people together in larger and larger countries was because it helped warfare. So if you're going to build a peaceful world, then you have to take away the things which have created the possibility of having warfare. So I think one of the things that we may look to in the future is smaller countries and countries where they don't need to spend as much of their money on warfare, they term it defense, as happens now. Baha'u'llah actually did that. Baha'u'llah told the Shah of Iran, the actual number of people that he needed in the country for safe purposes. So there's a model there from Baha'u'llah. We sometimes are arrogant towards people who come from a primitive background. A friend of mine, during the 9-year plan after the 10-year crusade, went to an island where a large number of Baha'is had come in over a very short period of time. And he got there, and they were living, it was a very primitive, you see, he said, primitive South Sea island, palm trees, you know, the ocean coming in, very, very nice. And he was there with his clipboard and his notes, what to do in a primitive society. And none of the ideas worked there. And he was, I think, just 20. And he's standing there, and he's like the great one who's come to tell them as a Baha'i how they can operate and run themselves. And he looked very sad, apparently. That was his words. And so they said, what's the problem? He said, well, I don't know how you're going to be able to elect your local spiritual assembly. And they said, well, you came here to show us. He said, I know, but there's nothing that I've got. He said, your language doesn't have descriptive things. You don't have a number of, you know, everybody, if you like, was Bill Smith or Lucy Smith, that thing. You don't have the names. I don't know what to do. So they said to him, okay, explain to us what we have to do. So he outlined the principles of the education, of the electoral system. And they said, oh, and they went on their way and they consulted. And they came back and they said, okay, how about if we all sit in a circle? And there was like 200 people. He said, we all sit in a big circle, yeah. And each one of us gets 9 stones. He said, yes. And he said, you tell us when to start, we'll say prayers. And then each one is, when we're going to vote, we will go and we will walk behind the people. Everyone will have their eyes closed, and we'll put the stone behind the person who wants to vote for. Would that work? And he said, brilliant. Yes. And they did that. And they elected the first local assembly there. Still be waiting to elect a local spiritual assembly. So in other words, simplicity in it when it gets translated. I think the future of the world is sound if we can recognize, participate, then you can move forward. So the arrogance of superiority, thinking we are superior, has to go. And we have to look to a future in which we all participate and cooperate with each other. And we'll all learn a great deal if we do that.
Thank you very much, Derek. That was excellent. And so we'll move into comments and questions now. If you could all unmute yourself when I call your name. And can you indicate by the usual raise of the hand when you wish to comment or ask a question? And if you're asking a question, if you direct it to either Viv or Derek or both of them. So if you could indicate. So any questions? And there was silence in heaven the space of 1 hour.
I just want to say that we've got a few hunter-gatherers left in Wales.
A few what?
We have a few hunter-gatherers left in Wales. I can see them on my back. Yeah.
Are they in the Welsh Assembly?
They could be. Sylvia had the hand up. Yeah.
I liked what was said about everything is too big, the countries are too big and they need to be smaller. So when you think, you know, in recent years, you know, Wales and Scotland have become devolved from countries from the UK, from England at the time. So I wonder I think there's some weight in that statement. That the countries are too big, but rather than me try and expand on it, could one of you expand on that? How you see in the future that if countries are smaller, they'll be able to cooperate and consult better together more effectively. That's my question.
So I think that one goes to you, Derek.
Yeah, I'm sure Viv will have some thoughts as he has hunter-gatherers in his area. Actually, there was two things which started me thinking this process some time ago. The first thing was when the Soviet Union broke up, the three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania immediately wanted their independence. And all the experts said they would not survive, they needed this, they needed that, they needed the other. And the Soviet Union actually wanted to come back in. And of course, when the people are freed, they actually went and stood and held hands outside their own homes to emphasize that they did not want the Soviet Union, the Russians, to come back in. And extremely well. And they're relatively small countries, and you know, they're healthy and developing and going well. Robert Adier, he was actually came to where we were serving at Bosch, and he told me when he worked for Gorbachev in Moscow, as he went there for a year or so, and he mentioned how the breakup of the Soviet Union had occurred. And so when Seema and I were back in England, we were back at Cambridge, one of the people who I got to meet had actually worked for Yeltsin, and he was a sabbatical at Cambridge. And I said to him, I said, well, what happened with the breakup of the Soviet Union? And he said, well, you know, we had created a centralized system. And I said, well, I know that. I said, well, what about it? He said, well, the trouble was we had told Area X to grow potatoes and Area Z to grow, you know, something else. He said, then we found as the breakup was occurring, you know, before they would send in, you know, the potatoes, and they would get stuff back. And that whole thing broke down. And everybody, what he said, his words, everybody simply wanted to go their own way, because the centralized planning of the Soviet Union had caused enormous shortages, except in Moscow. Moscow was the center, so Moscow did really well and the surrounding areas, but the rest of the Soviet Union, if you went to Siberian places, actually suffered great deprivation. But when people in the areas were given the opportunity to handle their own destiny, they were quite successful. So it seemed to me, the more I looked into it, that countries that were too large, and also towns as well, they found out that if a town is about 200,000 people, it's much better in terms of services and cooperation. So maybe this idea that everything has to be big, it's one of the things that should change for the future. And, you know, and for Baha'is, in terms of how would that affect the Baha'i system, local spiritual assemblies, as we call them, eventually will become local houses of justice. What the area of a local house of justice will be is still not determined. That will be something that will be decided later, much into the in the future. So you know, you're looking maybe 1,000 years and what the state of the world of that would be again. But I really think to get there and to be able to free ourselves of the so many prejudices we have, we need smaller things to be smaller and therefore efficient. Did that answer your question, Sylvia?
Thank you. Anybody else got a question they'd like to ask? Oh, David.
Hi, thank you, and thanks both of you for your speeches. Vivian, I must say, when people talk about us in the rowing boats, rowing in the same direction, I tend to think we're currently trying to row a sieve across the channel. It feels like it's we're in a holy world, man. It just seems to be pouring water from all sides. But anyway, one of the things I'm interested in is around this concept of identity. And within both of your talks, you talked about identity, whether it's been from Wales. You know, Vivian, you were very clear. I'm in the Valley. I'm a Welsh person. It's in my accent. There's an identity discussion there. And then Derek, you talked about persecution of females and slaves and owners and Americans and Spanish. Is it too simplistic to say part of the problem we have currently is that we keep identifying and we become so minutiae in identity that we then cause the barriers? And actually, I think, Vivian, you talked about just recognizing that we are human beings and this simple humanity. Is that the answer? We've all got to just accept that we shouldn't have an identity and therefore we're just human beings. That could be yes or no. That's a simplified question. The other one is, how do we do that?
Yeah, I think it was Derek who said about we're just one human race and not divided. But yes, Viv, you go on.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. I'm just thinking as well that, you know, within the Baha'i community, we don't have any religious clerics or anything like that. So other Baha'is here will be able to give wonderful answers as well to make their contributions. So I don't want to stop that happening as well. But I'm just thinking that, I think from a Baha'i point of view, our first identity is that we're world citizens when we speak in the worldly sense, or things that happen in the world. We see ourselves as world citizens, and the whole planet is being moved to accept our world citizenship through suffering, basically. Baha'u'llah gave us an easy way to arrive at it by saying, as I mentioned earlier, that the messengers of God are like physicians that prescribe the remedy for the diseases or the illnesses of the age in which they come. And this age is the dislocation of mankind to such an extent that disunity is the huge disease on this planet. So if Baha'u'llah addresses this, and he says, primarily, we are world citizens. The earth is but one country and mankind is citizens. Very simple statement. The earth is but one country and mankind is citizens. However, there is room for a sane patriotism as well, as long as it doesn't overlook the major priority that we are one humanity on this planet. We are moving towards world citizenship. So there's no harm in feeling, yes, I'm glad to be a Maori, or I'm glad to be a Nigerian, or I'm glad to be Icelandic, whatever it is. That's wonderful, because there's cultures that are necessary to give to the whole of mankind as their contribution to this diversity, the wholesome aspects of cultures, I should say. And there's so many things to do with that. With regards to, and I think my understanding is what Paul has come to do is to say, okay, there's a problem here that unless we see the priority ordering, and unless we see that this is divine guidance for us from a manifestation of God, then we will start going in the opposite direction and finding ways to disagree with each other because of this view or that view, or this lifestyle or that lifestyle. And that's what we're heavily into now. It's a non-spiritual nature. It's a competitive, adversarial nature that we're experiencing on the planet. And it seems that people are fighting for their identities in certain ways that they don't feel has been heard before. And there's some great justification for that when it comes to the oppression of, should we say, Black people over the years from slavery, and the terror and the horrible suffering that they've gone through, and other people as well, has to be heard and it has to be appreciated. So it's not demeaning that whatsoever. But the overall thing is that we're moving towards world citizenship with world institutions. And Derek was saying earlier as well about the largeness of countries, and so I just wanted to add something to that, and Derek touched on it, is that within the writings of the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi, he speaks about the evil of over-centralization. So it's the evil, it's over-centralization leads to what we've experienced in the Soviets and other places around the world as well. But there is a place for some form of moderate centralization, but over centralization should be avoided. And also within the Baha'i writings, Baha'u'llah speaks about the time when it will become necessary for the world's leaders to come together and to draw up plans for this lesser peace. And one of the aspects of this is that the borders of various countries will be definitely established. At the moment, there's so much conflict over difference of border and so on that you know, it's very difficult to get past the terrors that come from that. So these borders will be definitely decided and agreed upon. That's going to take some time. All the things that we're talking about now will come about not necessarily because the mankind or humanity and the leaders, whether political or religious or academic, whatever, are naturally going to fall into this way of thinking. But there is every indication from Baha'u'llah, from his writings, that there will be no other way of going forward other than uniting if we want to save the human race from annihilation. And I think climate change is a good thing to underpin this thing. So there are many, many teachings of Baha'u'llah about how do we avoid the suffering which will come our way if we don't go down this path of coming together and seeing ourselves as world citizens and enabling all the countries to work together with the main principle of justice operating.
Thank you.
I'd just like to make a thank you, Dave, on that. I think that there is a obvious fear of what the future is going to bring, and I think that one of the things that worries me when I look around is we tend to be very good on drawing together leaders on something, and they pass resolutions on how this is going to be so much better. But I think if we can bring in and involve people more in the process of what is required, so there's a true groundswell of support for things, then the world can change better. I mean, this is a world which has not known peace. We have really gone through the last 200 years of warfare all the time. I mean, people have said to me, why don't people grow their own crops in Africa or somewhere? And I'll say, well, they've got a war raging there at the moment. And they'll say, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, it's not a question of having the supermarket where you can go and get the food from. They grow their own food, and therefore they can't grow food because the war's raging and it's wrecked their crops. And I think if we can create societies that can flourish without warfare, then it becomes much easier. There's a part of, when you look down the western side of South America, when you're coming close to where Peru is and getting down to Chile, there is one place where they discovered was a major population center. And the reason that they had ignored it as such, this is Europeans, because there was no castles there was no fortifications. And the fact was, they didn't need it because they were not having warfare. So you build castles, you build fortresses when you are scared there's going to be warfare. And I think if we can stop spending our money in those terms, many of the things we think we can't do by not waging war on each other means what would be regarded as impossible becomes possible. And I think if that penny drops on people, then all the other things then will fall into place. And so, yeah, it's nice to be Welsh or Irish or Scottish. My mother's side, I'm a Scot. And there's things about the English that I was always in, if you like, in a sort of a split thing. Oh my God, the English did this, and you know, as a Scot, and et cetera, et cetera. But you know what the great thing is about human beings? just how creative we all are, is wherever we have lived, and we've lived in just about every place apart from the Antarctic on the planet, and we have created dishes which were native to that particular part of the world. When you go into the big cities of the world, you find restaurants selling food from this diversity that we are. We are united in our stomachs. You know, the food that we eat, we are united in. And if we had the brains that our stomachs obviously have in taste, then we recognize part of the greatness of what being human is, to enjoy the wonders of the planet we live on.
Yeah, there is a movement taking place called deliberative democracy, and that's beginning to catch on. It doesn't pretend that it wants to command government what to do, but they do recognize the need to get for large forums to come together of people to deliberate on issues and problems. And I think that's that recognition that everybody has a contribution to make to the sum of knowledge in society. I think that's one of the things we really recognize in the international Baha'i community, is this generation of knowledge which comes from participation by people with our principles in place of equality of men and women. Women in certain societies like India and Asia and Africa are having more of a say in the Baha'i international setting than they would otherwise have done. And this increased participation, this diversity. The Scientific American ran an article a few years ago about diversity and the need for diversity, whether it's a corporation or an organization. Diversity is creative. Diversity is generates. It's difficult. It's not to say it's frictionless, but diversity can be very creative. So on that basis, that lots of people have got things to say. Oh, great, Zoe. I'm glad to see you put your hand up. I want to see more hands up, please. You don't have to ask questions. You can comment as well freely. So Zoe, you've unmuted yourself, please.
Yes, I have. As a person who is has lived in each part of the United Kingdom, I can say that I'm a United Kingdom citizen as well as a world citizen. But what I'd like to do is recommend to everybody that you look on YouTube for the the concluding session of the Geneva Peace Week 2020, which I woke up to this morning. I have no idea how it happened to play on my new iPhone. I have no idea why, but I've never had that experience before. And I was absolutely thrilled because it gave a world view of what is constructive at the moment, apart from what we know in the Baha'i world through the Baha'i World News Service. And there were two things in it that really thrilled me. One was, again, the number of women taking part who were experts and also being called on to describe what was being discussed. Peace was central to sustainability. What was thrilling was the fact that the environmentalpeacebuilding.org is something that we can all have a look at and see whether we can contribute in some way. And another thing was that there were 4,000 people from 170 countries involved in this. Evidence of what works in peace building and in peacemaking. And that, as Baha'is, is something that we have spent a lifetime, for some of us, trying to do in our own small communities. They also included the arts. The creativity will be so uplifting to see. Please do have a look. It's Geneva Peace Week 2020. They had a poem that was created by 25 participants, which was called A Recipe for Peace. And there was an artist who did an illustration to go with this poem. And there was also, alongside all of the comments, there was a cartoonist. Now, I think he was a Syrian. And you could see him actually drawing as they were talking. And you talk about a picture speaking 1,000 words. Well, there was the power of the pencil and the paint box. So please enjoy. I really recommend that as very uplifting, especially as we are all encouraged to be creative in our communities, to think how we can encourage others. The young people that I met on my way walking this evening, one of whom I knew because I gave her a lift to the college. I hadn't seen her all through the lockdown. So I commented on her hair color, vibrant orange. It was a bright pink last time I gave her a lift. And she is working with the youth. And so I said, I have a suggestion for you. It's very difficult for them, but they're still managing to do something with the young people in the town. And because there is a green area near the youth club with a care home overlooking it, I said, maybe there is something that you could all do to entertain the people in the care home so that they could see you from their sitting room. And maybe you could do some kind of mime. Maybe you could use a diabolo. Maybe you could use some throwing and catching and juggling. I said, I'm sure you can be really creative. So I threw out the challenge and I'm waiting to see what will happen. Having gone to them with a box of wrapped chocolates to share with the staff and the residents during the Twin Holy Days, I couldn't go in, but I could at least take them something to mark the occasion and a card to tell them that I felt the service, that they were heroes. I took heroes, actually. They're the chocolates called heroes. And I hope that the message got through, that I was thinking of them, because otherwise all I can do is wave as I go past.
Thank you.
There's one thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking, which is, I think, in terms of a prime contribution that the Baha'i faith makes. All religions have come and have given a contribution to human society. And one of that contribution is consultation. And the way Baha'i consultation is radically different in terms of how one operates. And on the television show that I had in the US, a man called John Colstow, who's written a number of books, and he's really a great guy on consultation. He lives in Montana. And so I had him on, and I think we did 3 shows with him. And so we were talking, and he mentioned that in the consultative process, if it's done properly, then people can make decisions at the genius level. And which, I said, wow. And I said, well, can you give me some examples? He said, but, he was saying, we have to work at it. He said, consultation is a very shy creature in terms of the thing. And I said, well, give me some tips. I said, I've read your book, so what else are you suggesting? Because we're talking in between shows. And he said, well, have you ever chaired a meeting? And I said, yeah, frequently. He said, well, have you chaired like your local meetings? I said, well, yeah, I have been chairs. He said, have you ever had in your community somebody who always makes ridiculous recommendations? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we want to discuss something and this person comes up with some outrageous idea. And I said, yes, occasionally. And he started to smile. I said, no, frequently. He said, yeah, that's true. He said, so what do you do? I said, well, I feel as chair, I should, respect the person, allow them to say what they want. He said, do you ever act on the person's recommendation? I said, well, 40 odd, 50 years of being a Baha'i, I can never remember one of the recommendations being worth carrying forward. He said, correct. He said, but you forgot one point in Baha'i consultation. And I said, I don't think so. He said, yes, you have. Think about it. I said, well, I'm sorry, it's not clicking. He said, did you ever ask the person why they made that recommendation? I said, no, I never did. He said, that person has seen the problem from another angle. I said, oh, that makes sense. He said, the person's idea is still crazy and unworkable. He said, but what it allows is other people to say, wow, I never thought about that, and come up with a solution for it. He said, that's how you include everybody in the consultative process. He said, unless you ask somebody what was the reason why they made that suggestion, you never could foresee a problem. And I changed the way that I consulted after that. And I would say there was one person in our community who always made utterly ridiculous remarks. And when he was going to say something, everybody would, raise their eyebrows. And so I started saying, can you say why you said that? And he would outline the reason why. And everyone said, oh, we'd never thought of that. And then that's how we become more inclusive and understanding and including everybody. Because the moment you shut somebody down, for whatever reason, then it's very hard to get them to open up again.
Thank you. We've had lots of Baha'i contributions. Can I ask some of our guests, like Sharu or Peter? We would be delighted. I'm sorry, I don't know the gentleman Galaxy tab, but I'd be delighted, Sharu or Peter, if we could hear from you, your thoughts on what you've been listening to and the topic. Go on, Peter. Yeah.
A question for Derek, really. Is the troubles we've seen in the United States over the last week, are they illustrative of the fact that it is too large a country?
Well, that's a really good question. That most Americans, if you ask them, would say no. They're very proud of the United States. But I think that the problems that they have there, because of the way the politics have developed, I know most Baha'is don't want to talk about politics, but the fact is, I think in this circumstance, you need to do. There was an individual who acquired power, and the way that the American presidency system is, when the founders, when the creators of the American Constitution, they were worried because of the way they thought things had broken down with the British Empire, and they came up with something which they thought would work for their country, and it was obviously based upon the 13 original colonies, and it was clearly workable at that point in time. There is a movement, there's several movements in the US for breakaway. There are people on the West Coast who have said that, Washington, Oregon, and California should break away. There's some people in California who think California should break away. So I think it would then be like the 10th largest economy in the world. Texas still complains that, they were a separate country before they were merged into from Mexico. I think there is a danger, or there was a danger, of that movement going stronger. The worst one, which was primarily based in Idaho, and other places, but strongly in Idaho, very near to Coeur d'Alene in that area, was a movement to create a white-only section of America, and very sort of racist and separationists. I think those problems still exist. How they will address it, I'm not sure. I mean, the vote, what they acquired was, 145 million people voted. Certainly, as far as the person who's the current president, that's a defeat for him. But I think nobody can forget what he represents and the hold on the country. Strange enough, I know somebody who's a friend of mine, not of mine, who's in California. And this is years before Trump became known on the West Coast. And Peter said to me, he's a property owner and stuff, and we've become very good friends. He said, if this man ever comes and wants to involve you in some business deal, he said, my recommendation is not to be involved with it. I said, well, I've never heard of the man. He said, well, I went to school with him. And he said, and Peter's family were big property owners in New York City. And he said, our family will not deal with that man's family. And he listed the reasons why, And he said also, as a Baha'i, you'd find that he was a racist. And I said, oh. And he said, that's how they are. And so all of the things that Peter told me all those years ago, I saw manifested before my eyes. And I don't think for a lot of Americans, they knew what they were getting. But what you cannot forget, certainly 35%, he was saying what they wanted to hear. And so that's a problem in America. And so how that would split and become different, I don't know. Certainly, it's a problem for America, and how we'll come through it, I'm not really certain.
Thank you. Thank you. Peter, I'll come to you in a second, Sharo. Peter, did you have a view yourself on your question? Do you have an answer to your own question?
Well, only the observation that the split seems to be at state level as well as at country level. So if you broke it up into 50 separate countries, the same problems would exist in many of them.
But even the Republican states are different. We live in Wyoming. Now, what's interesting is that Americans are against a healthcare system, or the ones that support Trump, like there's in the United States, like in the UK. The strange thing is, in Wyoming, they ignore that and they make a policy point of no child is deprived of healthcare. They don't talk about it, but they actually do that, and which is right next door. So even the red states have a different understanding of what it means to be Republican. There is a strong libertarian strain which goes through a lot of it, an isolationist. So even those states, although they are red, as they point out, the different shades of red, and so it's a very complex thing. And I don't think they could actually have 50 odd countries. I think it would be an enormous problem, to get access and stuff. They have to learn somewhere to collaborate. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting what occurs over the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you, Sharo. You're next.
I came in partway through, so I haven't really taken on board all the various ideas that you all have shared earlier on. But what little I heard made me think about the need, if we are going to have this in 1,000 years, this one world view of, all of us as humankind, just one humankind, then I think what is required, and I don't know how your religion helps one to think about the issues of humility, yourself, and power, because sadly, as human beings, because we are driven by emotion, it's very difficult to recognize how we can do things for everybody and ourselves and still feel relatively comfortable, and how we can actually give up power, as we are seeing being played out in the United States at the moment, in Russia, in North Korea, all of these places where we do have what they say is one country, but whose will and whose power and whose influence. And so what I've heard little bits of, I'm sorry if I've gone off tangent, but those are the kind of things that come to my mind when I'm listening.
The Baha'i concept of power is quite different from the world's concept of power, Sharu, because we distinguish between authority and power. Authority lies within the institutions for certain, but as we've seen in many countries where institutions of government have been overthrown, they haven't had the power of the love of the people. They're exerting a dominance for sure, and they can use the state army and the police force to their ends. But the power lies in the unity of the people, and it's the Baha'i worldview is that, you know, we're trying to demonstrate by putting into practice the ideals that we have and the principles we have of creating that world unity which we have, and that is power, because unity is stronger. So powerful is the light of unity, Baha'u'llah says, that it can illumine the whole world. Would anyone else like to chip in to Sharu's point?
Actually,
I would like to say a few things there, Sharu, but I think Sylvia had your hand up. You seemed to half up and half down, Sylvia, was it?
Yes, it's a comment which I'd rather you address, because you actually spoke of this, which I was going to bring it back to, and what Zoe also said about empowerment. And I think when you started with your talk, you were saying about how our soul, and I would say there's definitely a shift in consciousness by people are becoming more aware of the oneness of humanity, and that itself is empowering us and helping to eradicate a lot of the problems there. But I'd rather you address it, Viv. I was actually wanting to bring it back to the empowerment and the soul. That's what I was going to say.
And can I just say before you start, Viv, I think time's reached the end, but I want you to fully say what you've got to say, and then we can just gradually bring it to an end, because I sense people are beginning to leave now. So please answer Sharu's point.
Thanks very much. Well, this will only take 3 hours. No, I'm just thinking that it is such an important, all the wonderful questions and the thought, I can, in a sense, I can feel all the thoughts reverberating off of each other, which is wonderful. But I think that I started off by speaking that there are, in a sense, there are two things that need to happen in the world. One is personal transformation, and you introduced the lovely word of humility. I love that concept, and I hope I can acquire it before I die. But I can never say I'm now humble, because then I won't be humble, will I? But there we are. That's the difficulty with that word. But the transformation of humanity is a guaranteed prediction, or is a guaranteed place to reach. And that's given by all the manifestations of God. You see, we can speak about these things in terms of political ways of understanding, which enable us to get into the problems and the difficulties and so on, and how to answer these masses of difficulties at this time is extremely, in actual fact, it can cause more disturbances unless we can agree on certain principles. So I think that the first principle that I get from all the teachings of the messengers of God is that God has created us. He created us with a soul, and that's our reality. And I remember somebody years ago, when I was a Baha'i youth, about 150 years ago, a lovely soul called Bill Sears, and many friends here would have met him or know about him. He said that, you know, he said that we have to look at people as if they're all letters from God. Okay, every one of us is a personal letter from God, but it's in an envelope we might not be particularly attracted to. For instance, the envelope might have running ink on it. It might have been dropped in the dirt and it's smudged or it's ripped and torn and so on. We look at that and think, oh, you know, we look at the outer envelope and we make judgments on the outer envelope all the time. And Baha'u'llah and all the great prophets have come along to say, look, everybody is a letter from God. And at the moment, mankind is learning more to become envelope experts than actually knowing the inner reality of human beings. So if we could see each other as not the external all the time, but we can see that our reality is one. We are created by God. He's not going to uncreate us. We're going to exist forever and ever and ever. And that's been promised by all the messengers of God in some way or another. There's another world apart from this world, and we go into it. But I just want to end this thought on, in the Baha'i writings, there are understandings of processes that are in play. And I would suggest to anybody to have a look at these processes. And one of the processes is the ever-advancing unity of various elements of society. So if we go back in mankind's history, we've had the unity of the family, that's united in the history, in the unity of the tribe. The tribes have come together in the city-state. City-states have come together in countries. And now it's time for the countries to come together for the unity of mankind. But for this to happen, in its sense that we can understand it, it means that we are all challenged to let go of immature ways of thinking and behaving about things. So one of the titles of Baha'u'llah is the proclaimer of the coming of age of mankind. So a manifestation of God has told us in this day, we are entering this long-awaited phase of mankind's mature development, which has been spoken about in terms of what it can realize. In Christian terminology, it can be the kingdom of God on earth. These are religious ways in which it's spoken about in the past. But it identifies a human race which is progressing through greater unities and greater developments, just like individuals go through certain developments from in the womb, to an infant, to a child, to adolescence, and now we're on the fringes of going into the maturity of the human race. So it means when we start analyzing problems, we have to disconnect ourselves from immature ways of looking at them, which Baha'u'llah says, really, we will go about this in two basic ways. Either we will disconnect from these immature ways which have kept us in conflict and contention and adversarial ways of organizing ourselves on the planet. We can either let go of that through knowing that we have to develop the way of thinking which includes oneness of the creation of God. All people are created as souls with their individual unique abilities, with the possibility of becoming all these wonderful qualities of humility, of selflessness, of thankfulness, of mercy and compassion. But also we need to understand as well from the Baha'i writings that we need to operate with these ways of looking at things with the needs of the age. And this is a mature way of thinking. What's keeping us back is our history all the time, is that we're all of us are aware, as we become more and more educated, of how horrific much of history has been. That's occurred through mankind's immature ways of being able to cope with the messengers of God teachings. Just like children, they're not capable of acting maturely because they haven't developed that capacity yet. We are on the fringes now of developing in the evolutionary process mature capacities to be able to think of things and understand things in abstracts and concepts that children just cannot understand. We're growing into that phase, but it does mean that we're not committed to repeat all the horrors and the miseries of an immature phase once we start seeing through the eyes of oneness that Baha'u'llah's brought, through the eyes of justice, and through all those wonderful qualities that are inherent in all of us, deposited in all of us by an all-loving creator.
Thanks, Vivian. I'll just give Sharu a chance to respond to that.
That was meaningful. Obviously, it's about actually understanding everything that you have just said. But I do think that these are excellent, from my perspective, aspirations, and it's obviously a journey, which is what I've understood. And with all of us in our religious or faiths that we believe in, we are all on a journey, and there are aspects of it that we find easier than other aspects of it. So thank you very much for that.
Could I make a quick point on this, for sure?
Just a quick point, Derek. Yeah.
Something that it's quick. One of the things which I've noticed is that when religions have gone around the world, they have simply built their places of worship in accordance with where they came from. And they didn't ask anybody. And I used to wonder, and Viv and I came perhaps roughly around the same time, I used to always wonder, when we build our places of worship, how we'll go about it. And, you know, the first local houses of worship are now being built. The first one. But before we could start, we discovered that what we had to do was go and talk to the people of the area, what they, A, what do they think about it? And B, what would they like to see in it? So it's the first time that actually a religion has gone to other people and said, we want to build a house of worship here, but we want it to be of service to you, rather than being, we're going to build our house of worship whether you like it or not. So they're doing that, and they've actually incorporated in the first one suggestions and recommendations from the people on the island, how the Baha'i house of worship can be of benefit to them. And that was a learning curve for me, because I could never work out how it was going to happen and what benefit. And I think perhaps that is the humility you're referring to. Baha'is don't imagine for 1 second they can do things without the collaboration with our other fellow human beings. And I think part of that is because, you know, and I'm not being derogatory when I said this, but we don't have any divines or priests. We don't really have any theologians from that point of view. So this is part of it. So the ones that have been built are beautiful, you know, but they incorporate what the local people want, who may not be Baha'is.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, so I'm going to ask everyone if you would unmute and show your appreciation for our two wonderful speakers who've given us some profound thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you.